Thank you for joining us on our journey here to preserve the history of mixed martial arts. When I wanted to take on this project, I needed help. I brought in one of my favorite matchmakers, Miguel Iturrate, and the MMA detective, Mike Davis. So to do this, we've been able to preserve history. Welcome and enjoy.
Welcome back to the LytesOut podcast. I am the MMA detective, Mike Davis. Along with me, as always, Miguel Iturrate. And joining us for Mixed Martial Artifacts, another episode, is Ed Thiesen. Ed, what item are we featuring today?
Today we have the gloves from UFC 34 that Matt Hughes wore over his victory against Carlos Newton.
All right, this is one of my all-time favorite UFC fights. It might be the most chaotic, bizarre, even controversial title changes in the history of the UFC. It took place UFC 34, November 2nd, 2001. An underdog coming in at 29-3 is Matt Hughes. Miguel Iturrate, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you were actually physically at this event.
Yeah, I was. I got to see the fight cage side, so I more than anything, I have the impression of what happened live, which has changed over the years in my mind. I got to talk to Jeremy Horn, who was in Matt Hughes's corner, and I guess officially at the event, I thought Newton had won the fight. That they had messed up the call, and I can explain that further. But the rest of the
go ahead.
Oh well, I mean, the bottom line is the argument is that Newton is in the triangle and Hughes hasn't picked up against the fence. Then Hughes slams him, and Newton's out. And Hughes wins the championship. That's the official line. Live, my impression, and impressions could be wrong, and I could be wrong, but live, it felt like that slam was more from Newton's triangle, and that it was Hughes who went out first. And I think that was redoubled, in my opinion, because I was fortunate enough to get into the octagon during the celebration and stuff, knowing some of the guys, and Horn actually grabbed. Hughes was out of it. He was as punch drunk as anybody at that moment. And Horn, very smart, grabbed him and told him, "You won the fight. Raise your hand." And Hughes goes off and does what he does. So that gave me that certain impression. Since then, watching it on video, it does look more like a slam than it did in the initial feel. Hughes was probably more there. You could also tell some of the other body motions he had that Horn points out that, lead to me to believe that he was probably, more coherent than Newton and, was the finisher of the fight. But originally at the place, there was that slight controversy.
Yes, and Carlos Newton actually filed a grievance in regards to it, and he got a rematch, obviously. But there's actually even more controversial things rather than just like what took place in regards to the title change. For instance, in UFC 31, Pat Miletich loses the belt to Carlos Newton. It was a fight that he was clearly ahead on all the scorecards. He was in the driver's seat, and then he gets caught in a bulldog choke. Taps out, and Pat, at this time, was obviously the first 170-pound UFC champion. He wanted a rematch, and he deserved a rematch. And the UFC told him, "You're going to have to beat another formidable opponent, and then we'll line you up with Newton again." So on the very next bout at UFC 32, Pat beats Shoney Carter. So he's thinking, "I did exactly what it is you told me. Now I need what's rightfully mine." The problem is that UFC 34 was being headlined with a rematch between Randy Couture and Pedro Izzo. So it was a rematch already. And the UFC, Joe Silva said, "We can't have a card with two rematches, being the main and co-main event, but we'll tell you what, we'll let you fill the 170-pound spot." Now, at this point, the UFC was strongly pushing Pat to retire because his body was falling apart. He wasn't, you could see the gait and the way he moved, that he was lumbering in certain instances because of the pain that he was in. And when Hughes came in, it took the ability for Pat to justify another title run because his teammate had it. My tinfoil hat told me, it was a good move by the UFC to kind of push Pat, into retirement, but we got corrected by Monty Cox. Monty explained to us what took place. There was just a whole bunch of strange set of circumstances that allowed Hughes, who was I think he was on a 7-fight win streak at the time, all outside of the UFC, and he was able to slide into that, into that spot. And truly, out of all the pieces we've done up until this point, this might be my favorite because of just watching this live and just remember seeing how this was played out and yelling at the TV, Hughes is out, Hughes is out. Truly just an amazing fight. How did you come about this piece?
I purchased these right directly from Joel Gold of Full Contact Fighter. He was gifted these gloves directly after the fight, right by Matt Hughes as a sponsor.
So Joe Gold, if you guys want, if you're watching this, you're in MMA history. And Joe Gold, his Full Contact Fighter Instagram, I'm not on Facebook, so I don't know, but his Instagram is one of the coolest trips down memory lane that you're ever going to go to. And it's all original photos and stock footage that he himself took. So Joe Gold at this point, he was pretty much a kingmaker in certain instances. He and Tap Out were the cream of the crop in regards to taking care of athletes. And Joe, just getting them from him is, pretty amazing. And with his contributions to the early time of mixed martial arts. Miguel, how would you say Matt Hughes, in regards to as a champion in that division, where do you rank him?
To me, he's an all-time great, and possibly the #1 all-time great. I think a lot of people would opt for St. Pierre. It's hard to argue against St. Pierre. I just chalk it up to my own personal choice that I prefer Hughes' style to watch than St. Pierre's. I don't like St. Pierre's style. I can't take away much of his contribution, but I rate them 1 and 2 back to back. I don't think other welters really crack in that. When people talk about Usman, he's just, should be just getting started here, for a run and stuff like that. So I think Hughes is an all-time great, and plus a historic all-time great, maybe the first great, right? Maybe the first great that we saw there. Things, everybody remembers the song and the cowboy entrance and stuff like that. And, the first guy that starts repeating his song and things like that, it might have been him,
Yeah.
And other than that, or Randy with maybe Thunderstruck, right? So, but that's what it was. Here he was on Randy's level. Randy, had star power and proved that later too. So, I think you're talking about Hughes is the legendary welterweight at this point. St. Pierre, we know everything about. Hughes, because of the tragedy later, and because so much of his stuff, came in the underground fighting, or the Midwest grind, as we call it. You're never going to get every story about Matt Hughes down. So, he's the mysterious all-time first welterweight great.
And Matt was known for his slams. On the independent grind here in the Midwest, I had the fortunate opportunity to see him fight on more than one occasion. But he was one of the guys that would walk around the octagon and just try to map out in his head where the metal beams were. So when he slammed somebody, he didn't want the give of the board to help them. And he would just he would walk around and test the cage, not so much for distance, just for understanding of where he was going to put the guy down. And he slammed Carlos Newton on more than one occasion in both fights. And, Matt, obviously, Pat Miletich started the 170-pound world title, but I think Matt Hughes kind of defined it and what it was and meant to be a champion. Tito Ortiz, obviously one of those guys that was somebody that you can look back and say, wow, he was probably the first real UFC champion. But if you look at the level of competition that Tito fought, Chuck kind of clearing out most of the people that really could have tested Tito. Matt didn't have that luxury. Matt was, in my opinion, like the first through and through world champion that the UFC had. Ed, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that, Matt. I always enjoyed watching Matt. He was, I got the chance to speak with him, to have him sign a certificate of authenticity prior to the train accident. And he was a pretty nice guy. I donated a little money to some charity of his for him taking care of me on this, but he verified everything. He was a close friend of Joel Gold's. Remembered giving these gloves to him after the fight, and it was a nice thing to get to speak with him prior to the accident.
Absolutely. So Joe Gold, if you're watching this, thank you so much for your contributions to mixed martial arts, especially the early days. Ed, always a pleasure. Yet another incredible item from your collection that we're displaying at Mixed Martial Artifacts. And Miguel, we will be back again next week. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Check out the full interview on iTunes, Spotify, and all major podcast platforms.